A warm welcome to our news briefing on COP15, the Convention on Biological Diversity. I'm Katie Talon, Albert's Industry Sustainability Manager and your chair for today. We've put together this event for those working in news, predominantly as gatherers and reporters, but of course it's open to all Albert participants and friends. We're only too well aware of the pressures on newsrooms at the moment, so we're recording today's session in order that it can be shared and watched by your colleagues at their convenience. But for those of us here with us here and now, it's interactive. So get ready with your questions. There'll be time for a Q&A at the end of the session. And we'll also be asking your opinion and questions during the presentation. You've been forewarned. Now is the moment to say a thanks to our event partners, Sergeant Disc, Good Energy, Camera, Green Tomato Cars and Location One, who facilitate all of our events and briefings. COP15, you say, but I thought we'd just had COP26. Don't worry, we're not briefing you on climate change politics from 2010. This is a conference of the parties on the Convention on Biological Diversity. At Albert, we get that biodiversity is interlinked with climate change. In fact, nature and its loss is often more palpable to audiences than rising greenhouse gases, and thus a better means of engaging audiences with both environmental issues. I got into climate science personally when I started realizing the decline of insects when I went camping and even on my windscreen when I was driving. Today, we are going to hear some quite upsetting stats on insect population decline. But we have an expert in our midst here to help us navigate this. Fresh from pre-talks in Geneva for COP15 is the head of International Advocacy at WWF. To provide us with an overview of the state of play and the ways news can cover this, I'm delighted to be handing over the screen to Bernadette Fischler Hooper.
Thank you very much, Katie, and good morning, everybody. Like Katie mentioned, I am the head of International Advocacy at WWF. And I personally think that the job title alone doesn't really explain what I'm doing. So I thought I'd maybe tell you a little bit more about that. I am in charge of the influencing strategies and international multilateral negotiations. So that means, for example, I was in charge of the team that was influencing the COP26 just now in Glasgow and any future climate COPs. But I am also working with my team to influence the CBD negotiations, the COP15, like Katie mentioned. I brought you a few pictures to show you how that looks like in practice, so you get an idea about my glamorous life. And I think Siobhan can share them. Here we go. So this is me in action. I'm doing an intervention at the CBD negotiations just now in Geneva. All the pictures are from Geneva. If you think that this doesn't look like a very dynamic picture, that might have to do with the fact that this was taken at 3:20 a.m. on a Saturday morning. So if anything, at least we work really hard on it, and people are working through the night. There is another one where you can see we are also doing, if you click, there is another one where you can see we're also doing like more typical NGO work like that, holding up placards, chanting and telling people that it's up to them to now take the right decisions. And lastly, I also wanted to show you my team. Here we go. You also see there's like 3 people on the screen because they were struck by COVID and were isolating in their hotel rooms. But so that's a big part of my team that we work together. So what we're going to do now this morning, I am going to try to give you a crash course about everything I think you should know about CBD and COP15. And then we're going to stop and I will ask the question back to you. If what of the things that I just told you about you think might be most interesting from a news point of view, or what's most newsworthy about all of that. And then we can pick up the conversation from there, because like you just seen, I'm more on the influencing negotiation side of things, and you're the news expert. So it's probably better if we discover together in the dialogue what is the most interesting parts for news programming for the rest of this year on this topic. So let's go back to the presentation. Let's start with what CBD is all about. Now, the interactive part isn't completely, so if we go to the next slide, we can see the headline for that. The interactive part is not entirely over yet. I now invite you to put in the chat box, can we just take the pictures very quickly again? Put in the chat box the question to you is, what does CBD stand for? There's a few who know, just pop it in the chat box, please. Nobody? Or can I just not see them? You can also guess. So it's nothing to do with cannabis, that one I can tell you for sure. Thank you. William has put everybody out of the misery. It stands for Convention on Biological Diversity. You will notice that it says biological diversity and not biodiversity. And I thought you find it interesting to know that the term biodiversity was actually invented later on in an attempt to make it more communicable. So if you think now is bad, it must have been really bad before that. So biodiversity is actually a kind of a media buzzword, apparently. At least that was what it was intended to be, but it's now the general term. Does anybody know by any chance when CBD started, when it was kicked off? I think Katie knows. Anybody? 1994 is good. So that was probably the first time it took place. It is from 1992, the Earth Summit. It started at the same time as the UNFCCC, so it's a sister convention of the UNFCCC. And if you look at them, it's definitely the little sister compared to the climate convention going forward. So, but what it is really about, and that's now going to back to the pictures, is the CBD. It's all about saving the planet, basically, and its people. You are very familiar, I'm sure, with these statistics and headlines. The Living Planet Index, that's something that the WWF produces every other year. It's really going downhill with species, so the population sizes of mammals, birds, fish, amphibians, and reptiles have been dropping since 1970 by nearly 70%. So that's more than 2/3 of nature is basically gone already over the last, since 1970. Then you've probably seen the headlines about the UN report, that's the IPBES. So if you know the IPCC, you've probably seen it in the headlines just yesterday and today. That's for the climate. They have the same kind of committee of scientists that's called the IPBES for biodiversity, and one of their reports said that 1 million species are at risk of extinction. That's quite a lot, and I'm sure you've also heard scientists already talking about the Earth's 6th mass extinction. So the job of the CBD is to change all of that and put a halt and reverse all of that. Sorry, one thing that I forgot to say at the beginning, and I should definitely mention, is you are, of course, very welcome to quote me on the things that I'm saying here, except, and that's a really strict exception, when I talk about country positions. In WWF, we have a very clear rule that only the officers in the country are allowed to discuss what their countries are doing for very good reasons. So just to give a drastic example, there is a WWF Ukraine, and there's also WWF Russia, and it's our job to keep all our colleagues safe. So that is why we have these very strict rules. Now let's go next to the next slide about what is the CBD COP all about. So the idea is that the CBD at COP15, a 10-year framework is going to be agreed. That is, well, 10-year framework, a framework up to 2030 is going to be agreed. That consists of goals and targets. If you think of them, if you know the SDGs, you can think of them like the SDGs for nature. And this, like, it was supposed to start in 2020, actually. It was supposed to agree in 2020, but for obvious reasons, there has been a delay. Well, yes, we can make the slides available afterwards. So there has been a delay. So in March, last month, for the Geneva sessions where I've just been, that was actually the first opportunity where countries had a chance to negotiate this draft proposal of goals and targets with this framework. It's called the GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework. Maybe also important to know there was actually a biodiversity framework, a 10-year framework before, but that was from 2010 to 2020. It was called the Aichi targets, named after a place in Japan, which is it's not very well known, but it existed. And there's of course also a plan to have another 10-year framework after 2030, up all the way to 2050. So this current framework that was supposed to be agreed in 2020 was the first draft, the first round of negotiations where all countries could come together in person again. And that is the only way to do these negotiations, unfortunately, was in March in Geneva. It went quite slow. And therefore they decided that there will be an additional meeting in June in Nairobi, where they're going to go over it all again. And then hopefully the draft is in a version that can be agreed at the COP15 in Kunming, that's in China, in possibly September, early September. So the date is not quite set yet, but the rumors are strong that it will kick off on the 28th or 29th of August for 2 weeks in China. So this is the steps how we're going to get to this 2030 global biodiversity framework. Now, let's go to the next slide. How is it going? So how good is it so far? I want to explain to you quickly, that's maybe the most dense slide of all, what is in the current draft of the framework. So we have firstly the vision for 2050, that is to live in harmony with nature. That is likely not going to change because that's also the overall vision of the CBD convention. And that's where all these 10-year frameworks stack up to. Then there will be a mission for 2030. At the current, in the current draft, it's to halt the loss of biodiversity, but we are very sure that we need this to be to reverse the loss of biodiversity, because just halting it and then leaving it at that level cannot be enough. Then there are 4 goals currently left. Those goals are for 2050. That's a bit of a novelty. They are, of course, they have much longer titles, but they are about the state of nature to be improved, about nature services to be enhanced. Then the benefits from genetic material and biodiversity are fairly shared, and financial contributions are provided. So that's the goals for 2050. And then there are 21 targets for 2030. If you look across, you can see that they cover pretty much every topic that is important in order to save the planet, from species preservation to agriculture to who is supposed to be contributing, like business citizens and so on. And there are 3 headlines. It's a bit messed up here, but the headlines are the targets 1 to 8 are about reducing the threats. Then the targets 9 to 13 are about people's needs arising for, or how people's needs are met through ecosystems. And then the targets 14 to 21 are about tools and solutions. So you can see there is that in the draft, like all the important topics are actually covered. Now the question is, how well are they covered? How ambitious, at what level of ambition are they covered? Because obviously you can have a very ambitious and good target on restoring ecosystems, or it can be very low. So on the next slide, you see an assessment that WWF did on how it's going in terms of the level of ambition. What you see here, so this is from a report called Bridging the Gap that WWF released just before the Geneva sessions. And what you see here is said gap. So on the right-hand side of this black horizontal, of this black line, going down is multilateral commitments over the last 2 years that have, where presidents, prime ministers, G7 leaders, G20 leaders, so on, big coalitions have committed to do things for nature. Each of the lines is a different headline commitment. And you can see that the commitments, the pledges, the high-level pledges are on a quite ambitious level. The column on the very left shows how well that ambition is reflected in the current draft of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And if you just look at all the red crosses, you see that it's not. So this is the problem at the moment. We have all the right topics covered, but we're not at the right level of ambition yet. That's also why it's so important that there's another negotiation session in Nairobi going forward. Right. I can highly recommend you to dive deeper into that report, but let's go on and talk about what happened in Geneva on the next slide. Oh, sorry, no. I cannot help myself, of course, and I also need to tell you what WWF thinks needs to be included in the Global Biodiversity Framework and at which level. So we think that the mission, like I said earlier, needs to be to reverse the loss of biodiversity to achieve a nature-positive world. So that the mission and the overall aim needs to be very clear that it is reversing the loss of biodiversity, the loss of nature by 2030. And then there are 5 areas that are absolute must-haves. There needs to be habitat conservation at a level of 30%. The footprint, that means that the footprint that countries' consumption and production have on other countries needs to be halved by 2030. The implementation mechanism needs to be strong and effective. That's one of the things why, for example, the previous framework failed, that there was no strong implementation mechanism. So the NDCs, for example, that you see in the climate regime, this kind of stuff doesn't exist as such in this framework. So that needs to be ramped up. There needs to be a lot of money put on the table, and I will be talking about that more. And then nature-based solutions, that's a buzzword that you have probably also come across in the context of COP26. Nature-based solutions need to be included and need to deliver for nature, climate, and people together. So that's my quick advertisement of WWF priorities, which I think is part of my job to do. But now let's talk about how it went in Geneva. So here are some outcomes from Geneva. Firstly, overall, the progress, it was really slow. It was predictably slow because it's the first time in 2 years that everybody come together again. And if you put something on the table and the whole world has an opinion on it, of course, that takes time. So the first reading in the first week was that all countries said what they think. In the second week, all countries made suggestions on each of the bits of the text. So they went through the text bit by bit by bit by bit, and everybody added their views. That makes like a ginormous text now with lots of different alternatives, and that's also the thing, that's the so many brackets. So text suggestions that are just suggestions or alternative suggestions, or where people are not sure whether they want to keep it, are getting put in brackets. That means that they're there as for now, but they need to be discussed further. And there's a lot of brackets left in the text. So at the moment, none of it is ready to be agreed, actually. There are some good news. First of all, it's happening. So it's really important that it's finally happening, because while our lives mostly were put on hold for 2 years, you cannot press pause on nature loss. So it's really important that this goals and targets are agreed really, really soon, because now we don't have 10 years, but only 8 years left to implement them as well. And another good news is that the mission was discussed. That's what happened at 3:20 a.m. on a Saturday morning, where I showed you the picture earlier. And when it was discussed, many countries supported the idea that it should be reversing as well as halting nature loss. And so that there seems to be general agreement that at least we know where we're going with all of this. We need at least we have a joint shared mission that all these goals and targets are supposed to deliver against. There were some social outcomes. For example, the nature-based solutions that I mentioned earlier, close to WWF's heart. Some countries like them, other countries loathe them with a passion, so they're quite in the balance. Equally is the 30 by 30 area-based conservation target. 30 by 30 means that we want to see 30% of land and 30% of oceans conserved by 2030. Then we have also some bad news, sadly. There is really a lack of political leadership. So these negotiations are at technical level, and there is not much, while we've seen all this like pledges that I mentioned earlier. At this stage, we don't see enough political leadership for ministers or even prime ministers and presidents to say this is important. All our lives depend on it. You have to get this right, get on with it. And that is exactly what we need between now and Kunming in order to make this happen. And then there's another bad news for us. Again, species extinction, a target close to our heart. The ambition on that target is actually lower than it was in the previous set of targets. And there were two bombshells at the end as well. And I want to dwell on them a little bit more. So the bombshells are the stickiest issues, the most difficult issues that cannot be resolved at technical level, and that definitely need to be taken up to political level so that ministers come together and discuss solutions on the way forward. And those are also the topics, if they are not resolved, all the rest is going to go down the drain. So those are the topics that will hold the entire framework of goals and targets hostage at the end. And those will be also the topics that will not be resolved until probably the very last day of COP. But you still need to get ministers and everybody else to actually get involved in this. So the first is money. It's always money. Money is of course important. And on the last day in Geneva, Gabon, on behalf of a quite substantially large group of developing countries, said that they would like to see developed countries to put forward 100 billion, that's equivalent to what is also the ask in the climate regime, 100 billion annually, but it should increase to 700 billion by 2030. So that's what they think they need in order to deliver this, to deliver on an ambitious set of goals and targets. Now that ask made some news, but I think it's important to be aware that this finance discussion has a lot more to it. So it's not only the ODA, the direct payments, the grants that flow from the developed world to the developing world, and quite rightly so, because the developed world has already ruined most of its nature. So if they want nature to be preserved, then they need to help do that where there is still some trees and savanna standing. But it is not only these direct payments. There's other things as well. For example, redirecting harmful subsidies. There's hundreds of billions that go to causes that are actually detrimental to nature. And it's a bit of a no-brainer to put your money where it helps nature instead of harms nature, but it is a lot more complicated than you think. And it is a very slow progress. But redirecting the subsidies, money that's being paid already, just making sure it pays for good stuff instead of bad stuff, would be quite a game changer on the finance side. Another thing that's really important is where does it come from and how does it get to where it needs to be? Where does it come from? There's of course skepticism, understandable. For example, from money coming from the private sector. So if companies pay, they have their profit in mind, and that's not necessarily always complementary to the benefits of the people on the ground. For example, so that's of course one question. So there's preferences of where that money comes from. On the other hand, the private sector is also a really great force for good in many cases. There's a big discussion about safeguards and how to handle that. Then it's also how to get where it is. There are funds that at the end of the year have actually still money left, just because it is so incredibly complicated to apply for this money. And developing countries, governments don't necessarily have lots of staff that can sit there and fill in for weeks on end any kind of spreadsheets in order to even apply for this money. So how to get that money out to where it's needed is another thing that can be massively improved. So I think it's important to bear in mind that the finance discussion has several aspects and facets, and it's not only how much money goes from the developed world to the developing world that is important. The other bombshell is the biopiracy debate. It's also something that went through the news headlines a little bit after Geneva. That is a topic that is very technical, but also extremely political. And I would like to make a quick attempt to try to explain to you what it's all about. So it comes from a part of the CBD convention that is about access to benefit sharing. Access to benefit sharing is about the owners of biodiversity get parts of the benefits. If, for example, another country, a company, somebody comes and uses that genetic material for, say, vaccines or other biotechnology, or like hair dye, whatever. So you know the stories about how there's new stuff discovered nearly daily in the Amazon that can cure cancer or whatever. Of course, the people who own that genetic material deserve a bit of the proceeds. So basically, if you think about it, like if you have a garden and there's an apple tree and I come along and take your apples and sell them, you probably want a bit of my money that I earned from that sale. So far, so good. The question is, of course, like if I say, well, I've got the apple picking technology and you don't, so I get all the money, that's part of the discussions. What makes it now even more complicated is that when the convention was done in 1992, sorry, the possibility to digitally sequence genetic material didn't exist at that time. So now the question is, what happens if somebody takes the genetic material, digitally sequences it? Do the owners of the genetic material still get the proceeds? And what if they merge that with another? So they can slap a patent on it, for example, and then they own it as a company. So this is also where big interest comes in, and that's where pharmaceutical companies and agrochem companies, for example, are extremely involved in the debate at the CBD negotiations as well. So there's a lot of vested interest behind this, and that's what makes it so political and so difficult to discuss. And if you think like in that, some of the pharmaceutical companies and agrochemical companies are heavily interfering with the negotiations as well, and then trying to push their interest. It's a little bit like they're a little bit the equivalent of what the fossil fuel companies are for climate change. So it's that important and big. Right. So I've dwelled on it now enough, I think. Yes, now, oh yeah, I put together a few pictures for you. Again, that's from, to give you like a visual impression from Geneva. So when I said so many brackets, if you look at this text here, everything that's in red is in brackets. So you can see there's more brackets than non-bracketed text at the moment, but there's definitely a lot to do. And there is this little cartoon on the left was circulating at the end about just to make fun of the negotiations as they are. And you see at the same time, the news advertised that this is the last chance to save biodiversity, and people were working really late through the night as well. One of the criticisms that are often raised about, for example, the nature positive aim, the goal to be nature positive, is that it's more difficult to measure than, for example, the 1.5 degree goal, where you say, oh, it's all about CO2, but actually that's not true, right? There's a lot more other greenhouse gases, so it's already a lot more complicated there as well. What is different with nature is that you need to look at different aspects. So it's species, habitats, ecosystem intactness, and so on. And that's also why there is a very technical and very live discussion at the CBD negotiations, what indicators should and shouldn't be there. If you want to have one measure, I can highly recommend the Living Planet Index, which measures the species abundance, which is a very good indicator, and which is also broken down by regions and by countries. And it's done by WWF, so that's why I know it really well. And then there was another question. It's not difficult to claim royalties on DNA benefits taken from biodiversity treatment. Royalties and benefits. Yeah, that's true. So there's a lot of discussion about that. And then the question, can you tell us a bit more about how nature biodiversity is being measured? That's what we talked just about.
Yeah, we've had a couple of questions as well, pre-questions. So I think that was such a thorough deep dive you gave us there, Bernadette. And my overriding impression was that this is really urgent, but that thank goodness there's experts like you working on this, and that the mission is really, really positive one. But specifically for news, why is it so important that the public understand the CBD and also biodiversity?
Well, one of the reasons why the previous framework wasn't very well implemented was also because it was not very well known. It is no surprise that if the general public cares about something, politicians care about it, and then it's more likely to happen. And that's why it's really important that the general public knows about this framework, knows about what's at stake, and also and therefore pushes politicians, and politicians then put the priorities behind it, put the mandate behind it, and also make sure that it's implemented, because it always is implemented by governments. So the individual countries need to then implement what they have agreed previously, just like with the climate agreement, where the NDCs, the national climate plans, are the place where the actual implementation is happening. So the rubber hits the road based on how important politicians think it is to do it. I have actually prepared a slide, so maybe let's go back to that.
We have two minutes officially left, so
okay. Then just enjoy that slide. One tip that I spoke to our media lead on biodiversity as well, what he thinks I should recommend you the most, and he talked about that there are lots of opportunities with the session in Nairobi. There would be a lot of opportunities to link that to human interest stories, which is, I think, in Kenya quite good, but also then later in Kunming in China, to just show how this links through on what happens on the ground. What I thought might be the most newsworthy, I'm not sure if you would agree, is that in my experience, when I give interviews, people always just want to know what's the bad news and who is misbehaving. So jeopardy and opportunity, I think, is something that can be linked quite well together, talking about that nature is in decline, and that these goals and targets can pave a way back from the brink. And if it goes well, also it would be great to celebrate that this framework will actually, if implemented properly, reverse the loss of nature by 2030. There's a bit about holding world leaders to account. We just talked about that, also why it's so important to make it public, to talk about it publicly. And that's also where country positions often come in. So that's the good, bad, and the ugly, as usual. The sticky issues, the two ones that I just raised earlier, I think they will be definitely quite newsworthy, because that's where the hot debates will happen. And then there's other stuff that can go wrong that I mentioned earlier, like the species extinction can be not ambitious enough, and some of the transformational changes might not come through or might be overlooked. And that's where it's probably also quite helpful if, for example, there's more media attention, the likelihood that it goes wrong is less high. So those were my thoughts. And with 1 minute to spare.
Thank you, Bernadette. I think that's a fantastic endpoint, actually, giving us the top tips for the newsworthy stories. I would just like to say, for Albert, biodiversity is a key priority area on and off screen. So I hope, for yourselves today, that we've given you, Bernadette's imparted you with lots of knowledge on this most pressing issue, and also tips on, what's newsworthy and how to incorporate the CBD into your stories. Thanks again for our partners, Sergeant Disc, Good Energy, CAMA, Green Tomato Cars, and Location One. Thanks for all your questions. Do get in touch with us at Albert, and if you've got any further questions, and we'll endeavour to answer them. But Bernadette, a huge thank you both for your work and for your time today.
Yeah, very welcome. I've just popped my email address in the chat box as well. Very happy for you to contact me. And I think we're going to share the slides afterwards, I guess, as well. Siobhan can make them available. And yeah, I hope to see you all in Nairobi, maybe, or hopefully in Kunming or somewhere else. Thank you very much.
Thank you.